Have you ever watched Survivor? Grandfather of modern challenge-based reality shows. Around 20 people get put in a remote area and slowly get picked off one by one. By the time there are 3 or 4 left, the remaining competitors are left to convince a jury of their peers to vouch for them to win the $1 million prize. It's often when this final meeting commences, formerly known as the Final Tribal Council, that often proves to be the toughest part of the game. Speaking to the jury is a minefield of high stakes and low sweeping drama. Physically fighting your way to the top is one thing, but how well you've played the social game can radically alter your chances. With a well-timed question or interrogative aside, it can only take one juror to sway the whole group, and even likable candidates can easily stick their foot in their mouth.
You know, I don't think Natalie deserves the money at all. I don't know, what she really did along the way except align with Russell.
The winner of Survivor Samoa, Natalie.
Being left to navigate a multi-layered assessment of your playstyle is a big burden to shoulder, but it's necessary to get to the end. You're walking on thin ice with shards of glass surrounding you, and on the other side of the screen you can certainly feel it. It's far from a unique experience in reality television, but its intensity is seldom matched by other shows of its ilk, let alone those outside its niche. But for the purposes of this video, I think we've already found one. In a sea often flooded with ship wars aplenty, this fandom remains one of the significant few to largely avoid them. There were never many ships sent out from harbor in the first place, but the few that were there were able to navigate some pretty rocky waters. Candace and Jeremy was spoken for by mid-season 2, Lawrence and Linda always got enough time, Perry and Doof, definitely a consistent presence, Buford and Baljeet, see Perry and Doof. The Ferb Vanessa Monty thing just kind of seemed to work itself out, regardless of whether or not we approved of the final result. And yet for all the successful ships we've sent out to sea, there's always been one that's been lingering on the docks a little too long. The evolving dynamic between Phineas and Isabella is genuinely one of the most elusive concepts presented in verse. It's a part of the show that's eventually acknowledged as an innate part of its structure, yet was consistently kept at arm's length as far as storytelling goes. By no means was the setup revolutionary, but the amount of time spent yo-yoing a potential resolution for these two might set a record. After nearly a decade of following this saga, the episode that was meant to put it to rest actually kicked the hornet's nest. Though it did finally answer the age-old question, it also managed to be one of the most polarizing episodes to date. Love it or hate it, it is a significant piece of the show's history and serves to be a versatile springboard for discussion even to this very day. I do not know how to cope with the knowledge that the worst Phineas and Ferb special shares a birthday with the best Eddie Murphy movie.
Joyous Easter! My guts are coming out!
I got to see this man peak in theaters. Given how much it's talked about, I'm kinda surprised nobody's attempted to do this before. I wouldn't consider Act Your Age to be one of my favorite episodes, but it still gives me a lot to think about. I've probably been following this shit before I even knew what that was. It had tangible stakes to it, and as cartoonishly far-fetched as certain situations became, everyone who shipped it seemed to be painfully aware of how relatable this dynamic could be. Its lows are just as worthy of a spotlight as its highs, and this episode is the ideal conduit to look at both. The story and the functional catalyst for its existence has a lot of history behind it, but not much of it is centralized. Deconstructing Act Your Age alone is liable to make you re-examine the entire series, let alone all the additional notes and details there are to uncover. There's no real mystery to unravel here, we're just organizing the case file a little bit. I wanted to try and go as deep into the weeds as possible, and with some luck, maybe some of this mess will start to make sense. If you just needed a decent summation of the special's flaws and such, just check this video out. It's a succinct, well-researched, and well-articulated analysis. For the masochists in the audience, I think it's time to kick things off. This is an objective look at Act Your Age. Part 1. What was? Truly, it's difficult to launch into unpacking this years-long saga without running through the background context. Telling the story of Actor Age is telling the story of the main ship. As lopsided as it can feel at times, the core of it is just the dynamic between these two people. Many of you saw everything go down in real time, but I think actually verbalizing what happened is gonna end up being helpful down the line. You can't really delve into this thing without talking about who's at the center of it. So, that's exactly what we're gonna do. Isabella, leader, explorer, adventurer, girl from across the street. From the very beginning of the series, this character was meant to stand a cut above the rest. Created to become more of an aspirational figure for the target audience, Isabella was someone a bit closer to the action in the backyard, but a lot more grounded in comparison. Her leadership of Fireside Girl Troop 46321 became a vehicle for the boys to knock out the daily project without breaking a sweat. Whether for the sake of earning another patch or just pitching in for the sake of it, the precision and speed at which they worked quickly established Isabella as a smart, capable, and determined lead. The only thing that was shown to change the trajectory of her work was her wayward crush on Phineas. Early on in the show's lifespan, the regular dynamics we'd come to know and love for a decade were still forming. In the eyes of many, I'd reckon that the early friendship of the two would barely qualify as such. Compared to how much they're remembered, they were a bit more distant in association. You don't get the sense that they really know each other very well. But the latter decidedly was more proactive in wanting to get stuff done. It didn't help that the A-plot gang was much larger initially. A whole slew of mostly generic kid incidentals filled out the space that would later be occupied mainly by 3 characters. I think the episode One Good Scare was the main catalyst in turning me to the dark side. It made a huge impression on me as an episode of this show, but it also showcased this relationship in a different way than I remembered seeing it before. There's a lot about their arrangement that was serendipitous, and they really took advantage of it here. In a situation where this girl is normally chasing after these two to try to help, she gets sidelined for such a minor inconvenience, and it turns into a spectacle. Phineas hasn't really gone to such lengths for anyone else up to that point. I mean, the occasional monster truck rally or giant oil painting doesn't really stack up to all of this. I mean, yeah, he's doing it to entertain himself, but he seriously went all out, and he didn't have to. Other than the roller coaster and maybe the treehouse robots, there wasn't really any other entity that matched the haunted house's elaborate scale. She's forced to be a bystander to a grade of chaos that's normally brought to life by her and the troops, only jumping in when it becomes a literal life and death struggle.
Now that was scary.
I mean, this was actually life and death. How the fuck did she not see any of this shit happening? She was in the backyard. They cut to a shot of her in the backyard with everyone leaving, and this was 2 seconds after she just caught him. I don't understand. How are you this oblivious? What is going on? Where are the troops? Call them the replacements, bitch. What's going on? She's not seen anything. This is the worst parent in Disney history. I didn't know you could crack that, but it's true. It's true. She's the worst, bro. She's the fucking worst. You didn't see any of this? Your son almost died. The role reversal definitely helped make this dynamic feel less one-sided and reinforce the potential for this duo to become a tour de force later on. For the rest of the first run, you can see their interactions shift as time moves on. As a particularly steadfast character, it's not a surprise that Isabella's feelings would take more of a focus. In Season 1, her obligations between hanging with him and leading the troop was mainly weighed in the latter's favor. It was clear that the troop was a package deal, and while her affections were transparent, they were mostly relegated to seconds-long asides and visual gags. Whatever time was spent highlighting it was pretty neutral in presentation. Isabella herself coasted through this stage quite passively, with none of her pining transitioning into larger displays of affection. It seemed like she was just happy to be along for the ride. She was in the midst of the action, but her crush itself was only acknowledged from afar. Season 2 onward, she started to lean into the crush more, and the creatives followed suit. We not only see her start to pursue more dedicated time with Phineas, but also the first few significant examples of his oblivious nature at play.
Isabella, wanna come and help me find Meep?
Sure. I still have to get my you wouldn't know cute if it bit your legs off accomplishment patch.
Cool, let's go.
Her appearances with the Fireside Girls, while still an important element of the A-plot, become a bit more segregated to put more focus on their fearless leader. Developing their individual personalities also came with more introspection and inverse discussion of the crush. The punchline starts to pack a punch with more elaborately constructed situations, making for more absurd conclusions.
You want me to come on a romantic cruise with you?
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Hey everyone, I'm wearing a diaper.
So, do I know romance or what?
There was still a lot of basic character building done in this time, but the progression of the relationship started to take a more active role after the premiere of the hour-long epic Summer Belongs to You. In a storyline involving the main kids embarking on a cross-continental journey to circumnavigate the globe on the longest day of the year, there are several dynamics in flux that get explored. 3/4 of the way back home, they make a pit stop in Paris, France, the city of love, a chance Isabella takes to finally facilitate some alone time with Phineas. But considering the time crunch that they're on, neither were really on the same page about their priorities.
We could share a crepe sucre at this Parisian cafe. All who wants to do is try, it's the play.
This song kind of sets a precedent. It's a hauntingly beautiful track, and even after so much time, the shots that accompany it are brutal. It's the hardest she's pushed for his attention up to this point, and she fell completely under his radar. As painful as it was to see go down, this sequence ended up setting the stage for some of her most cogent character development yet. Within the third act, there's a sequence on a deserted island that I refuse to spoil because even after 13 years, it will hit you hard on your first watch. I can't do it justice just describing it, it just kinda serves as a redemption for the episode, and further proof of how simultaneously selfless and mature this girl is, even in the midst of absolutely crippling heartbreak. It's not something she's rewarded for. The ending dance may have dulled the sting of the parents incident, but to the end of the series, it is one of her strongest appearances as a character. This subplot, let alone the entire episode, is invaluable to understanding the basis for how these two are seen for the rest of the series, as it likely was the moment that brought Phinabella to the forefront of everyone's attention. It also became the model for how the ship was represented in future episodes, because these situations would constantly tie back to her making a huge leap of faith, a sacrifice of sorts, and the universe just completely invalidating that, one way or another. And we're kind of just left to cope with the remains of this outcome. Isabella, as a character and a conduit for a lot of these big ideas, definitely deserved more recognition for her work on several fronts, even if you don't factor the crush in at all. But ironically, it was more likely these moments that would become more commodified than they should be. From this point onward, the balance between leading the troop and getting closer to Phineas was starting to falter based on how they were written. The act of building the projects themselves were streamlined to the point where they could be entirely ancillary to the stories being told. At this point, we're also well familiar with the Fireside Girls and their abilities, so whatever is done with them would have to be a bit more nuanced to take up significant headspace. So it made sense to give the shippers a little more gas here. It seemed more incidental than not, but the folks driving the story started to codify these moments between the two a bit differently. Its recurrence is considered so innate to this universe that it starts to become a plot device. It's one of the great mysteries of Danville canon. Mom never sees the inventions, Doof always fails at evil, and under no circumstances will Phineas know about this little crush thing. Before, it really was his own lack of self-awareness guiding those interactions. By this point, it seemed like the universe is actively working against this girl. You know, for the plot. I mean, it's all jokes, to some degree, but it likely started to take a toll on the audience and how they see her. They still threw her some bones later on, but there was an air that the one-sided nature of everything was running thin. If not with the folks at home, definitely with Isabella herself.
Well then, I know what we're gonna do tonight.
Really?
Yeah, we're gonna make our own New Year's ball and drop it from outer space.
Your mother is right, Phineas. You have such an active imagination.
Not active enough.
The more salty she got, the more they had to lean into her being more imaginative to tell this joke. She just seems so tired of this shit. This went on indefinitely, but in some cosmic way, the end of this series, as we knew it then, marked the beginning of Actor Age's creation. Sometime after Across the Second Dimension dropped, Disney was starting to pull back on support for the show. Dan and Swampy were down to produce a prospective 5th season, but the mouse wasn't sure they wanted to take the plunge. While they thought it over, they gave the crew a series of specials to make in addition to the regular season 4 order greenlit before. They did this to try and keep everyone together in case they wanted to renew, but based on how long they wanted everyone to wait on their answer, Dan and Swampy likely would have had to restaff anyway. So their choices were either to hold out to possibly continue the show and do it with a new production crew, which likely would have complicated things, or end it where it was with the same folks on board. You can probably guess which option they went with at the time. The ensuing season was dedicated to giving this wealth of characters some closure. For the girl across the street, it meant finally granting her alone time and peppering a few more moments of solace within certain episodes. Despite the one-sided nature of the crush, they managed to craft whole episodes dedicated to tipping the scales back in her favor. I can appreciate the irony in criticizing the crew for creating a one-sided dynamic while only really going on to describe said one side in detail. This is not really going to be balanced, but I do want to try and give the other side its due. Just give me a minute here. Phineas. He's a kid? You know what, that actually kind of works. He's a kid with simple desires. The Mensa level intelligence and advanced engineering skills don't obscure his innate aspirations. He's always been relatively focused on the task at hand, but rarely at the expense of one of his best friends. People have a habit of equating his brand of obliviousness with inattentiveness, which in this case definitely doesn't apply. While not as outwardly perceptive as one may expect, it's clear that Phineas always prioritized Isabella above other things. He's a nice dude, and he's gone out of his way to help strangers before if he could, but there's a clear line of consideration he extends to her and nobody else. She's like the only person he's postponed projects for. There's stuff that he just outright refuses to do if he knows she can't take part in it. Half the patches on her sash are kinda his and Ferb's doing when you think about it. They started pushing his protective side towards the end of the show, but all throughout he's put himself in harm's way specifically to help her. Even if they made it clear at some point that he doesn't expressly like her, it's clear from the jump, in some capacity, that he's always loved her.
Man, what the fuck is you talking about?
What the fuck was that?
I'm sorry, man. You know, I wasn't thinking about it.
There's a mutual respect in how they operate. They understand each other's goals well and are able to push each other to the next level. You're not always able to see it, but they're well in sync. The way they pursue their passions is what drives them primarily. It's just this one thing that they can never really connect on. The will they won't they scheme established around Phineas and Isabella was arguably one of the most popular parts of the show, but the mystery created around whether or not the crew would actually cement things followed it for a while. That is, until one fateful day in early 2013 changed everything. On one significant Platypus Day's Eve, the existence of a mysterious time skip episode was acknowledged on a live stream. Noted to take place approximately 10 years into the future, it was specifically singled out as an episode set to focus on the two. The only other evidence of such an idea in the works would be a coupling of tweets alluding to the creation of a duet. The stream itself has since become lost media, but I do remember watching the announcement in real time. The only real evidence of its existence, other than a dead link, is a transcript to the first 5 minutes or so, which is now also gone, so fuck me, I guess. A lot of these elements were revealed a good 6 months before the episode dropped, with the episode itself being in the can a while before that. It wasn't referred to in depth, but this soon became a point of no return. The 2-year gap in between this moment and the eventual release led to rampant speculation and investigation. Endless toil and strife, indescribable hype and anticipation. This was the lead up to the penultimate episode of the show, the aforementioned Act Your Age. This would roughly bring us up to the present day. Originally, I'd planned that this video would be dropping 10 years to the day of that very live stream, but I mean, I guess this is good enough. I guess. Obviously, it's been over 10 years since this has been announced, and well over 8 years since the premiere of the episode itself. Like I said, there's still so much to talk about to this very day. I probably teased it before, but it's crazy. I mean, this is one of the most definitive bookends they have ever written for this whole universe of shows, and it's the one that people dog on the most. All these years later, we're still complaining about it. I imagined that doing a deep dive into this would likely involve more personal introspection on my part. You know, how you digest the show and what it offers is definitely going to color your viewing experience. And I didn't experience the most radical change in opinion on this one. I've always stopped short of looking at the more critical elements of its reception, but even in its wake, it struck me as a piping hot bowl of, well, that certainly was a thing that happened. In hindsight, it didn't take long to come to the conclusion that this maybe felt like it came a bit too late, didn't do much to really rally the fan base beyond the song. It just wasn't bringing that much to the surface. To be honest, I think I was more relieved than excited that it was finally out. Having now rewatched it at least a dozen times now, I'm not clamoring to do so again, but I can say at least that I understand its issues a lot better. And by its issues, I really mean the show's issues leading up to this one regarding character development, but you didn't hear that from me. I want to try to save most of the hard analysis for later, but I think understanding some of these flaws now will help us break that down when the time comes. In proportion to all the stuff she's done over the course of the first run, Isabella's progress as a character is terribly out of sync with how much screen time she's gotten. The bare basics of who she is are there, but it seems like there wasn't enough gray matter filling in those more subtle gaps. You don't have a straightforward grasp of what motivates her outside of her two main spheres of interest, and because of that, the story that's supposed to fulfill one of her huge end goals feels a bit lost and aimless. For characters like Candace or Doofenshmirtz, we have a heightened sense of awareness of who they are through their philosophies and numerous life experiences. We know how they tick because we've seen them rise and fall, and rise again through many circumstances outside of their explicit narrative function. This girl strikes me as a person who shoulders a similar level of responsibility, carrying the show in ways we don't often think about. Yet we don't get the same level of introspection from her on the most basic of subjects, let alone any extra context on her feelings. There's plenty of trivia or wayward asides we can tie back to her personally, but I can't recall a time where the writer's room went far enough to explore her lived experience. I'm making it sound deeper than it needs to be, but it could have been as simple as giving her a few well-placed throwaway lines or something. There are prominent characters that have been developed mainly through a series of one-offs. Buford has made a complete 180 because he just had the absolute best bangers from the start. Even telling us why she has her crush in the first place would say a lot. Not because of the exact answer, I mean, I can make a few educated guesses, but rather because it's her perspective filling in that blank space. I've always felt like she's a top-tier character, and even after realizing all this, I can't say I've changed my mind on that front. But seeing the wider effects of this revelation play out in the special makes it more of a bittersweet thing to revisit. It's kind of wild to facilitate this integral character that's crafted to be an aspirational figure, but have most of her abilities and accomplishments narrowed down mainly to the patches on her sash. And it seems like that's not exactly a wayward opinion.
I would sit Isabella down and say, honey, you're multi-talented, but your achievements are not your value as a person. I see all those badges that you have from your Fireside Girl days. You're great. You're awesome and you're rocking it, but you're more than that. You are enough just as you are.
There's enough people out there who already assume there's more lurking under the surface. Maybe she's a bit more quirky or temperamental than she'd let on. I mean, she has her moments, but some stick out more than others.
You're going down, dweeb!
I will beat you. It is a mathematical certainty. It's extreme! It's extreme!
Look, I'm not saying we needed a Helga on the Couch style breakdown of her life or anything, but what I am saying is that almost everybody on the block would pull up for that shit. I mean, come on. Come on. You know what kind of fan base you've got? Everyone would love to see that. In any event, looking into any of these traits would make for a rich discussion, but even if she were just the same Isabella with a deeper understanding of her worldview, this probably wouldn't even be a talking point. The lack of deeper analysis probably made it harder to dictate how this episode flowed. If we had a better idea of what drives her and how she sees him, there would have been a smarter and more succinct way of creating a story like Act Your Age. But enough of this. It's finally time to look at how all of that comes to a head in the story itself. Part 2. What is? We open on Dan and Swampy in the wild, sitting in front of a pile of prop fan mail. It's just a framing device, so they're only popping in here and at the tail end, but it does lend a sense of finality to everything. They introduce this as the time skip episode, a concept that's often perpetuated by fans, just like the ones that they've picked to lead us in.
Are we ever going to see Perry the Platypus get a girlfriend?
No, not going to happen. No. Here's another one. This one is from Donnie. It says, are we ever going to see Phineas and Ferb as teenagers?
Yes.
The actual story fades in on Phineas and Ferb in their old bedroom talking about the future. We gather glimpses of what the core group is doing. Buford's an art school kid, Balsheet's a professor, and Ferb is going to a school abroad, loosely involved in affairs of a wizardly nature. Candace was already in law school, presumably kicking ass. The only one who's a bit aimless at the moment is Phineas.
I'm gonna go with my gut. It's between these two. Danville U and Tri-State State. Both really good schools. Looks like I have some thinking to do.
I find it fascinating that the inventions were never really mentioned. Within a scene and the rest of the episode, this core chunk of their younger selves is barely treated as a footnote. I doubt that they would remain as big a priority to everyone as time moves on, but you'd think it would be referenced in the scope of how they'd impact their futures. I mean, these two kids are probably Mensa-level geniuses, but the world would mainly get to see that through the shit that they build, right? Imagine the gravity of their work. Like, how would that translate 10 years later? I could also potentially see that being used as an explanation for why they'd allow this kid to enroll like 2 minutes before orientation starts. No doubt the Ivy Leagues were holding WWE-style grudge matches to determine who went where. See, it's the little things you gotta look out for. This conversation is undercut by Carl, the new leader of Alka, getting in contact with Perry over a presumed defection back to evil from Doofenshmirtz. Flabbergasted, he takes off to figure out what's going on. Also, Irving is there. Originally, there was a note here that I was supposed to see how this stacks up to the Alka Files or Milo timeline, but I hardly see a point in that now. Maybe we can table this for another 5 years or so. Cutting back to the four boys, it's made glaringly obvious that someone's missing here. Isabella hasn't been coming round as much as she did in the good old days. There's no reason specified at the current moment, but the takeaway from this aside was that Phineas was totally out of the loop on her goings-on, and regrettably so. It was this vague observation that prompted Balsheet to drop a bomb out of fucking nowhere.
You do know she had a giant crush on you for ages.
No.
Alright, I'm gonna do my best to not nitpick and actually tackle what's going on here. A sizable chunk of complaints thrown at this episode have to do with character development. Given how big the period of time we're skipping is, I can understand why everyone may feel a bit distant from their younger selves, and that's okay. This seems like it's supposed to be more of a down-to-earth retelling of how they're embracing different parts of their lives. I mean, everyone changes a little bit when they get older. I don't see any reason why the same can't apply here. Watching this conversation go down, it does feel like there wasn't much tethering this conversation to this specific universe and this specific set of characters. It could be a creative choice, acknowledging that sometimes big life events do blur together and shit just kinda ends up being anticlimactic. Though given the context of who these people are and what they're dealing with, this is just a little too blasé. You're playing it off too much. They're trying to convey that these goofballs have had their heads in the clouds and they're now thoroughly planted on firm soil, but they refuse to show us how they even got there. This is just blending in a little too much, and for what could be one of the last major times these guys are assembled, it's generic to a painful degree. It might seem like a quick aside for everyone else, but for this specific group of people, this would probably still be a pretty big deal to just out this girl. If everyone were truly in character, Isabella would be in the backyard out for blood within 20 seconds or less. What's especially wild about this too, is that there have been some hints sprinkled throughout other parts of the initial run that Baljeet may have actually been in her spot at some point in time.
You know, Isabella, I sometimes wonder if it was mere coincidence that it was you and I chosen to portray the young, happy couple.
Chosen? Baljeet, you charged at that empty chair like a crazed bull.
So for him to just drop this news, even in the event of everyone splitting up, it just doesn't feel right.
Just stop.
Actually formed.
Just stop it.
Like, I do not know how that is physically possible.
Stop.
She
No.
changed
Just
her
stop it.
eyeballs.
I think it would have made more sense for it to come up as a bit of a sore spot and just have the kid put two and two together. Between him wistfully pining in her absence and the additional decade of pent-up frustration from the other three, something should just kind of click at that point. You know, giving him the agency to actually figure that out, that would be a good way to emphasize how much everyone's grown, you know? They're adults now. They can make their own decisions. I also think it would have been good to get some more introspective from the guy on the receiving end of this stunning revelation. The way Isabella's absence is referenced would imply that it's not expressly known to him. She could be busy, she could be trying to distance herself from her feelings, maybe a bit of both. He doesn't even know where she's going, or that she's even going in the first place. Surely he has some shower thoughts on these two polar experiences. Can we also just talk about how much everyone despises this line? It's just peak terrible.
Why didn't you guys ever tell me?
We are guys. We do not talk about feelings.
Bullshit. Bullshit.
Hate it. Stop the presses. It's awful, guys. As much as the feelings line really bothers me, I think this part may be the most in line with the show as we know it. Original Phineas and Ferb had a habit of brushing off smaller pedantic details so you could focus on the bigger picture. Like, there's no point in worrying why Ferb's hair is green when he's drag racing in his space Bugatti. What color is yours? It's a redirection in a way. It's telling us that the smaller quibbles about how this came to pass don't really matter. And yeah, it's a joke that patently doesn't make sense, but it does serve a purpose here. Whether it serves said purpose well is a whole other can of worms. I think we already know the answer, though. In the following scene, Agent P catches up to his old ex-nemesis, who's still subverting expectations as per usual. Blissfully unaware of the outer perception of his plans, he explains that he's been chipping away at an innator that can trigger a midlife crisis in him. The song starts up and Perry looks moderately uncomfortable, which is deserving of a sensible chuckle or two. After a brief health scare, the Ocelot Man wanders off in search of adventure, to which Perry is set to follow right behind him. There's a fair amount of questions to ask about how Dr. D holds up during the time skip given what we now know post Phineas and Ferb effect, but to reiterate, it's a bit pointless to cover it now. I will say that it is ironic that he looped back into old habits. Earlier on, a lot of his schemes involved him trying to make up for boxes he didn't fit in when he was younger, with him later growing more as a person and reveling in his weird sensibilities. Another solid link back to the days of old. I'm definitely biased towards the A-Plot gang, but I feel like his part of the story really stuck out. Doof humor is a good antidote to this weird, somber tone the rest of the story takes on, but I almost feel like he needed something more, like he's too good for any of this shit. If this were better written, I would have preferred he not be featured at all, but in this case, I'm kinda torn. Cutting back to the Nacholet, we're plopped in the middle of the Fireside Girls deliberating over Ginger's nothing text to Baljeet. They use the scene to bring them to the backyard for the Matchmaker C-plot, but before establishing that, they had this contentious conversation.
Manipulate the situation. Manip the what? Pretend you don't care about your movie, but then hint that it's playing at the theater next to the froyo place he likes. The seed is planted, and he'll think it's his idea to go there.
I just got it!
You know, it can't just be all jokes with y'all. This shit is kind of whack. It hits this weird in-between where it's not absurd enough, but also not cynical enough to take it somewhere humorous. See, this is why we needed the extra context. Frankly, I'm confused as to how they could have gotten together in the first place, given how much Ginger is roasted for her tastes. I truly do not get it. Midlife Hines crashes a speedboat into a slightly larger ship and manically swims back to shore to test out a sports car. Meanwhile, Phineas runs into Nana Shapiro, who lets him know that her granddaughter is leaving for school 2 weeks earlier than he expected. Hoping to catch her before her shift ends, he hightails it to the restaurant while his friends set up a romantic dinner for two. Doof hits the dealership to take Perry on a joyride, and these two subplots share a bit more space to set up an old convention of a typical Phineas and Ferb episode. We end up back at the restaurant just as Isabella is making her way back to her car, and once she drops that photo, we're already plunged into the highlight of this episode. So this song is easily the cornerstone of this entire thing. I don't think I can eulogize it in any succinct way, but it deserves all the praise it gets. There's a lot of tonal dissonance in the larger plot, but in this specific moment, all the regret and anguish built up over X amount of time had a really strong emotional core to live in, which got funneled into this piece. This 3-minute track brings whoever hears it to pieces, but unites the wider audience with its main sentiment. Even with the cheesy ship name drop, that montage never gets easier to watch. I would also say that all the stuff that came before was a decent warm-up to what might have been. For a brief time, the dueling storylines dragged me in without making the switch back to the main one jarring. Rare Phinabella for calling the girls out on their shit, but just not doing anything else but helping them.
They're bound to fall madly in love like they were always meant to be.
You know, you can't force these things.
Oh, come on. We're girls. It's what we do.
It's very, very surprising, I know. The chorus of the song sets up the duo's next few moves. Phineas dejectedly sulks back to the house, while Isabella presumably drives off to Danville State. Right as the backyard is all set up, the dumpster from a few scenes back clears everything away seamlessly. This didn't really affect that outcome, but it seemed like through a set of serendipitous circumstances, neither teen would get back in time for this whole date thing anyway, so... After an ill-fated skydiving exercise, Hines finally takes off his necklace-inator thingy, which leads to an absolutely based Lawrence cameo. Also, Linda is there.
You know how every day for the last 20 years I've relaxed with a nice cup of Earl Grey? Well, not today, Linda. Today I'm pulling out all the stops. Darjeeling.
You are a madman.
Finally, we're on Maple Drive, where an unexpected development reveals itself.
What you doing?
This 5 to 10 second sequence of them just staring at each other is intriguing on its own. Like they've both got big, complicated feelings about everything related to the other, but in each other's company, they're not jumping into anything. It's not even really nervousness, it's shock and realization and a moment to absorb the past few hours before each does what they need to do. Not especially profound, but given the circumstances, it contrasts well against most other parts of this episode. I would probably just pull the full clip of their exchange up, but if I do, I can't collect the 729 I would have earned from this pseudo-dissertation. It's not easy to describe, but it's simple enough to start there. It's not built up to be the big talk or anything. They didn't even know they'd be there. They've been a part of each other long enough that their talking isn't as straightforward as it would be from our point of view. This scene is in keeping with the mood of the wider story, but it actually means something here. One thing I picked up on the additional 20 minutes was how far the role reversal between the two went. I mean, the girl ended up being conflicted or guilty about shit that's so far out of her control when interrupted. In place of that, the episode kind of shifts the blame to the opposite side here. Philosophically speaking, not really into that. That said, the remorse does ground their dialogue, and it works pretty well, all things considered. Neither seemed like they were really enjoying any part of this until the very end, which probably is a decent enough con for a ship that's built off 1,001 really fluffy vignettes in time. I think the funniest part of the episode is that these weirdos all decided to congregate and create a reverse Jeb Bush moment while these two are trying to reconnect. Insignificant back then, but highly notable today. Are they calling this relationship a cheap-ass Tumblr post? I mean, when does everyone start clapping? So the decision is made, the two are set to reunite in 2 weeks and hopefully catch up on everything. After the episode reveals that Ferbnessa is indeed canon, Finn makes one last move in the wake of this new relationship.
Phineas? What are you doing?
This.
We end on a golden exchange and cut to 2 emotional show run, well, 1.5, technically, but potato. Swampy solemnly sobbing over this surreptitious montage sets up for a decent wrap leading into the final credits roll.
Oh, get a grip, Swampy.
Part 3. What else? So, that was the episode. Moment of truth time. Was it good? Not really, but it definitely is not as bad as it's hyped up to be. Like I said, it's really more of a case of the hype becoming its undoing. There's a half-decent framework set up, but the actual execution wasn't strong enough to carry everything. It doesn't try to re-establish these characters or overemphasize how much they would have changed to make a lot of this work. Everything from the pacing to the motivations, even down to the title, is at least somewhat misplaced. This episode doesn't know how it wants to deliver its message, and with the way they chose to present it, it gives a very blasé attitude to an event that should be more lively, if not outright celebratory. I would say that Phineas and Isabella are actually the least out of character, despite the former's abject gloominess, because the way their friends fail to hold it down is absolutely extraordinary. It's just so weird the way they try to salvage everything. They did everything and yet nothing, so effortlessly. And while wrapping up, this friend group just counterbalances the whole canonizing a decades-old ship thing. Pretty much everyone outside the main duo and the creators sound thoroughly apathetic and dry. A lot of people tend to vibe with Doof's plot because it really is just business as usual for him, but also too minor to break through any of the real melodrama. Again, if the episode was better coordinated, I'd reckon that he'd feel more like an intrusion. Like he'd be cutting in the middle of a bunch of hard-hitting drama we're yearning to see play out in full. His scenes did provide levity to an overall dour setup, which I do appreciate. The song in the final scene really is where the heart of this idea lies, but the build-up it took to get us there makes for a less cathartic watch than it should have been. Everything leading up to it was a series of fetch quests paired up with C-tier doof antics. It would have been cool if everyone were just a little more proactive in meaningful ways. The bare surface layer of the episode is simple enough, but emotionally speaking, it just works against the presumed appeal of seeing this ship in action. It took me a minute to notice, but when you think about it, all the golden moments stem from the specials where their arc is squarely a C-plot with like less than 5 minutes of development. The real difference is that while these tend to be overshadowed by big, showy action-adventure type deals, it gives the specials the chance to acknowledge how Phineas and Isabella specifically work in tandem. They have significant strengths individually and are self-sustainable, but as a pair they lift each other up and keep each other energized. They're going through the motions to cater to this relationship that's built off loyalty and adventure while not falling back on anything that made it stand out in the first place. Friendship is literally the key, and they're refusing to acknowledge the shape of the keyhole. The tone of the special is arguably the dominant factor here. The vibe is just very, very confused. The lighthearted side of the show and the reasonable amount of drama are fighting for headspace when they don't really need to be. But I do get it. After years of playing off the viability of this relationship advancing as nothing more than a one-off gag, having to sit down and actually figure out how to make it happen was probably much easier said than done. I think a bit more exposition would have gone a long way, just lingering on how much they've matured as people would have made the transition smoother. It has 44 minutes of action squeezed into half the runtime, so I do get why they're light on background info. If anything, it might have worked in the episode's favor. There's a fair amount of people that consider this one of, if not the worst Phineas and Ferb episode in existence, but there's also a fair amount that consider it among the best. People identify with this special because it's supposed to be a proper bookend to a show that they've likely been growing up with for a good chunk of their lives. It's not a coincidence that certain fans of Actor Age were in high school when it dropped. It's definitely not on the same wavelength as the rest of the series, but the ensuing events made it feel grounded and closer to their own personal experiences. To me, the special only really embraces these mature versions of the characters in an aesthetic sense. It doesn't have time to acknowledge how they've changed and how they're plunging into these new stages of their lives. there's no connective tissue linking any of the ideas they want to introduce. Without being able to put chronology to this long-standing friendship, it gives us next to no idea as to how that's developed on either side, or even how that synergy seemingly faded away. In its place is just empty, vague, circular, waxing sentimental. It's just empty calories worth of angst. With all this in mind, I still walk away from it viewing it as aggressively mid and nothing more. By my own standards for a bad Phineas and Ferb joint, it definitely should be up there. Sure, the lack of character work really hurts, but I think that last 5 minutes truly saves its bacon. It's the part most anyone remembers, and for the episode's flaws, they still beautifully fulfilled the end goal. On that note, there's a few critiques I didn't personally have, but I felt were important enough to mention anyway. The visual design of this episode is fascinating. While the general structure and characterization is probably driving your opinion on its quality, it's also important to note how the passage of time was represented by the funny drawings that move. One of the most significant details of Actor Age would be concerning the character design, which was done by a prominent fan artist that caught Dan's attention one day. The full story is actually really cool. I would recommend watching this featurette. Should tell you everything you need to know. In current year, it's not uncommon for people online to pick up gigs based on fan art or other engagement with their favorite show, but 10 years ago was a bit more rare. Some of us didn't even think that was possible. So catching wind of this and seeing updates develop in real time was a huge W for the fans. You have no idea. There was a fair amount of support for the move, but when the episode itself dropped, people started to ask questions. There's a fair amount of skepticism aimed at the final product. I guess there's a feeling that these older versions of the characters weren't thought out very well. There's not much of a fresh individual aesthetic to connect them to their older personalities. By older, of course, I mean younger, in the context of the universe, but who was keeping track? And there's a decent discussion to be had there, but I can't help but think there's a weird case of buyer's remorse nestled in this critique. I mean, based on her past work, I don't feel like this take was super unexpected. She was hired off the strength of her original design, so it makes sense that they'd choose to primarily roll with those. 3 of the main 5 had their designs virtually unchanged, but even then, it sets a good degree of separation between them and their younger counterparts. The second half of this complaint concerns how the characters physically aged. There's been earlier episodes where characters do show significant age on them, whether to emphasize comedic effect or to fit the passage of time they're presented within. Here, most of the characters seem unaffected, with the older characters seemingly not having aged at all in about 10 years. Doof's transformation, or lack thereof, is a pretty stark contrast from the other times we see him as a salty old codger.
Well, it's already 4:30. I think I'm going to bed. Curse you, Perry the Platypus.
Presumably those were longer gaps of time, so if anything, the kids should probably show the most dramatic change, which they do, but not to the degree that everyone had hoped. Now, I can agree that the lack of age in some of these designs perhaps wasn't considered much, but for the college kids, I think they did the best that they could. Given how visually abstract a lot of them are, it'd be difficult to change up their look without changing the character itself. Any change too radical basically thrusts that character into their own AU. The slimmed down Buford is a great example of this in play. Anyone who had more of a normal construction was transformed well enough through their outfits alone. But for Phineas and Ferb especially, this would have been much easier said than done. Back in the day, I'd wager to say that there were very few transformative designs the fandom cooked up that could double as decent replacements for these. I found way more suitable designs within a week of research for this than I have in years of being a part of this thing. Personally, I will take Phineas with a mullet or the Philip J. Fry cut any day of the week over this one, but I don't consider this one to be a major strike in any sense. So to sum up, I think the biggest sin of Actor Age may have been being too hyped for its own good. For a show like this, the idea of jumping into such a calculated premise is a lot. No matter how you feel about the episode, I feel compelled to give Dan and Swampy props for being open to it in the first place. It's far from a perfect 10 out of 10, but I do believe a lot of the frustration and anger that's directed at the episode has to do with poorly managed expectations. The nature of Phineas and Ferb handling these subjects with gravitas and seriousness was always going to be a gamble. For an episode that's trying to wrap up everyone's life story in one fell swoop, the stakes were always going to be high. If the episode was too open-minded, then it would probably leave the opposite of closure for this long-running saga. If it were too narrow in focus, then it might be the last glimpse we get of those characters if they don't appear afterward. Fundamentally, how you see these characters is going to change how you think they should be handled. They could have conceived their darkest, grittiest, realest, most satisfying epic in a dramatic sense, but if it was too far removed from the source material, it would just fall flat. Occasionally, people refer to Actor Age as nothing more than vapid fanfiction, and I will never see it. In fact, the fans were kind of holding it down from the jump. This episode is purely fanfiction and aesthetic. There's a whole glut of thoughtful, witty, analytical, and emotionally compelling works created by fans in many positions. It doesn't hold a candle to the simplest of them, and truth be told, there's a lot of value in trying to figure out what might have been. Some have taken the liberty of rewriting this episode, but most of them have had their own well-executed ideas in mind for this ship for a very long time. And that's not even getting into the literal, physical embodiment of what might have been. It occurs to me that by this point in time, you probably should have a better idea of this whole project, and I had planned for this video to drop after I had already sung their praises, but that obviously has not happened yet. So I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version today so that I can live to absolutely shower them with praise another day. Okay? Okay. Wacky. The musical without a cool acronym. It is a completely fan-made Phineas and Ferb parody musical that's like 3 hours long, and it kicks ass. Was conceived not too long after the end of the first run. The original version was filmed in early 2019, and the virtual version, the one that you'd probably come to know if you already knew about this project, was released in late 2021. I refuse to get into the weeds of it right now, but it is an incredibly fitting tribute to the whole ethos of this show. Good folks, good show, good vibes. Within the last 20 to 30 minutes of the virtual version, you have a scene that mirrors the one with Phineas and Candace under the bridge in Paris. You know, the one where he gives her that motivational pep talk about how she's Candace Flynn and she was already one of the baddest motherfuckers in this whole scene. So she receives another one in this musical. And the sequence here has a similar end result. Candace walks away renewed with a sense of energy and purpose. And this, in turn, inspires Isabella to initiate a confession. So these two goobers congregate for 2.5 minutes, and they sit and they talk through these issues that have kind of been boiling over for a decade in our minds. And they have a real dialogue about their relationship. And it's insane because, again, 2.5 minutes out of like nearly 3 hours of content. But this, for the most part, I think this rivals almost anything presented in Actor Age. If you didn't know any better, you'd probably assume that this was repurposed from like a lost episode or something. Because the way that it's written is beautifully crafted. It definitely got into the minds of these characters. These are the ones that you know and love.
You're my best friend. After Ferb, of course.
And Buford! Right?
Sure.
But the real kicker out of all of it is that it doesn't even have a definitive ending to it. See, Actor Age can be kind of a slog for some people, but the real solace is in the fact that Phineas and Isabella, they sit and they talk things out, and they actually enter a formal relationship. That's the deal. That's the entire point. This did not even approach that. This is like 1/10 of the runtime. It felt so much better to watch, and nothing happened.
I do think you're really special. You're sweet, and you're crafty, and cute, and a great leader. And when the time comes when I do think about those things, who knows?
So, what you're saying is, in the future, there's hope?
There's always hope.
This man didn't even say yes or no. He deferred. Basically, what Phineas said was, let's put a pin in that for now. How about we pick this back up in like 5 years or something? He didn't even say yes. But it felt so much better to watch because I felt like I was really seeing him think through the implications of this, and everything that he said to her was completely in character. If the episode had an ounce of the finesse any of those examples do, it would be a lot better off. You may be feeling the same, but what if I told you there's someone who could have pulled it off? Someone who knows the show front to back and the ship left to right, that had tangible investment in their success. Someone who was able to write Candace's quietest, softest moments just as well as Isabella's most expressive. Someone who can imbue these characters with so much nuance and still keep them funny. Had this been entrusted to them, I believe it would have been a top 20 banger on sight. Enter Aliki Theophilopoulos, storyboard artist, writer, lyricist, and don't take this the wrong way, the de facto captain of this ship. Starting out on some of the last 2D Disney movies and swiftly moving into TV work thereafter, Phineas and Ferb was one of her first projects next to Chalk Zone, can't disrespect the greats. Having been one of the few crew members that stayed on basically the entire first run, she's gotten to hype up this ship from beginning to end. Her contributions to the show are vast, but her primary focus, aside from making Candace like the strongest character in this entire universe, has been focused squarely on these two. There's a whole slew of storyboards or sketches outlining opportunities to feature this ship in a more definitive light. I don't think she's ever spoken at length about it, and we've most likely seen a lot of her ideas in isolation already, but comparing how she interprets the duo's dynamic with the work presented in Act Your Age, you can probably deduce she had no direct impact on any of it. And you'd be correct. However, there is another special episode produced within the same time period that she did have a hand in, and if the ideas presented therein were tweaked just a tiny bit, that special would easily be eaten Act Your Age's lunch.
What you doing?
Oh, hi, Isabella.
Night of the Living Pharmacist, one of the 5 final hour-long specials, is one of the most underrated pieces of Phineas and Ferb media to date. If you're one of the collective 6 people who knew about it before now, you've already seen the master at work. Buried under a subplot concerning an unexpected Doofenshmirtz zombie takeover lies a storyline regarding Phineas, Isabella, and an emotional bravery patch. You can kinda see where this is headed, can't you?
So you see, Phineas, I can only earn the patch by walking up to someone I care about and telling them face to face that I've got a huge crush on you.
The former is not consciously involved in the story around the patch, but he feeds into it in ways that we've never seen before. It's a through line that was actually followed pretty well up until the very end, where it's not even alluded to in the final scene. Okay, so by this point in the story, the day is saved, of course, but the last few survivors don't really remember much of their adventure. That would include the confession scene featured like 2 minutes prior. This wouldn't really be an issue if they didn't just gloss over the apex of the story.
What happened?
I remember building the vortex sprayer, but after that, I've got no clue.
Me neither, but whatever happened, it worked.
There's some cut dialogue from this animatic that wraps everything up in like 3 or 4 sentences.
What happened?
I remember building the vortex sprayer, but after that, I've got no clue.
The only thing that sticks out in my brain is your patch. I don't know what happened, but I do know that I'll hang on to this patch for the rest of my life.
And I mean, like, whole ass shipping bias aside, this is literally the best way to end this story. What sense did it make to cut this? I gotta be honest, Aliki is kinda infamous for having all of her board ideas capped, especially if it's related to these two. And most of the time, I assume it's attributed to, like, emotional intensity. Like, you know, I don't know about that. I mean, they're 9.
We're 9.
Maybe we should hold off on that for now. And I mean, fair, I guess. Part of the original confession scene was scrapped for just as much. But this extra dialogue doesn't even reference that in specific. All it does is tie back into the patch storyline. Technically speaking, it would have been an ideal ending for the Phinabella arc had they chosen not to go with something like Act Your Age at all. It's such a quiet acceptance of their then current setup, and it's presented in a way that doesn't feel like it rejects the arc outright. It's a pretty subtle mood to attach to both of these characters, an attribute neither are particularly well known for. It was the weirdest cut. Like, so we can let shit like this go, but somehow this is over the line? Alright, dude. Alright. Phinabella flopped so that Lumini could light up a room. I can't believe it. I'm unpacking the conspiracy right now. Even if we're not strictly speaking about this episode, they've done this shit before. Look at those Excalibur boards, dude. I knew that they were gonna be pure heat. But I did not expect this. So many good gags, so many good jokes. They just left this shit out entirely, bro. She made that swamp sequence. But the reason why I'm choosing to highlight this next to Actor Age is because I think her time on the show did more under the hood than we originally thought. As a creative, it seems like the ethos of her work runs a lot deeper than just propping up this relationship by itself. I want to circle back to Candace because, like I said, I do consider her one of the primary architects for this character. Was able to balance her out at her most expressive and her most subtle. Easily one of the strongest members of the entire cast because she was allowed to explore all these feelings and situations that others didn't, and there was always something to have been said based on her vast experience. My commentary on Isabella largely still holds up, but it's clear that Aliki had a more distinctive voice in mind for her.
This is no big deal. I'm gonna walk right through there, like I always do, and just ask me to hang out, like we always do. Oh, except this time it's to a wedding, and I'll be wearing taffeta, and my family will be doing the chicken dance, and Uncle Charlie will pass on to the punch bowl. You know, because of his sleep disorder. Pull it together, Garcia Shapiro. Better get those nerves to stand down, or your what you doing game will be off.
There's more of an offbeat vibe, but is still largely the same person. There's a layer of emotional complexity underneath this ramble of word vomit. Just kind of feels like stuff's happening, which is actually a really good thing here. These are like the only two prominent female characters to speak of. Obviously that's not a knock against Vanessa or Charlene or any of the great side characters, but these two are really at the center. It's kind of important to highlight what was done for them that enabled them to be as compelling as they are. I can tell you this much, Aliki had nothing to do with Mission Marvel, and that is painfully obvious. It's wild because a lot of this was kind of foreshadowed ages ago, but most of us would have never known about it. There's a pair of shorts that she did for Nickelodeon's second animated anthology series, Random Cartoons, circa 2008. I remember enjoying both of them as a kid, but the second one, titled Girls on the Go, really only resonated with me recently. The plot is about a girl on a bad date, and that's it. That's the entire thing. Now, obviously, it's still comedically invested, but it's just the day in the life of this random teenager. It's funny, it's fresh, it's really earnest, not necessarily over the top. Definitely doesn't strike me as something Nickelodeon would have been picking up, even in the midst of similar ideas. There's a lot to be said about a short that can run with a story like this and still remain down-to-earth in presentation. It really mirrors the approach that she took in Phineas and Ferb and how she tried to inject more emotional intelligence into these characters. It takes being yourself to a whole other level, and apparently Dan felt the same way because by her own testimony, these were the shorts that got her on the show in the first place. It just adds an extra layer of audacity onto everything, because here you have a person that can feel these conflicts in a way that doesn't take away from the general vibe of this universe, but can still make them funny and compelling. And you pretty much never let her do the thing that you hired her to do. Every time she's about to start cooking, you take away all the ingredients. I don't get it. I understand that Dan does not swoop out of the shadows and personally veto her work every single time her boards get rejected, but it does kind of feel like that though. Question: what's the one thing that was always said of this ship when it came up in panels and such?
It's just so innocent and so honest, and that's what I think makes the entire storyline work so well between the two of them, is that it's just so honest.
Yeah, exactly. It was an honest crush. It can certainly help drive a story along, but once you turn it into a plot device or a long-running gag, it loses its sincerity. Most of it boils down to dissecting character choice, and part of Isabella's stagnation as a person came from a lack of clear direction in this regard. At its most authentic, the crush is just that. It's a minor but specific part of her character. She can't help how she feels, but she can, in theory, make choices related to it. It's no different than Agent P figuring out when to spring a trap, or Buford deciding when to drop a sick new one-liner. If she doesn't get to make those choices, she doesn't get to go anywhere new. She's at the mercy of whatever's funny in the writer's room that week. It's performative as hell, but it's also dishonest at its core. It's not true to her existence, and there's a reason why it got tiring to watch after a while. Acknowledging this ship as openly as Lowkey did might actually have been peak character building all along. The idea that the crush doesn't have to be sensationalized within show canon or made the entire ethos of Isabella as a person really does mean a lot. Even with her development as a character being so flawed, she still lives up to her purpose as an aspirational figure you can identify with. That early framework setup made it easier for her to stand pretty well on her own merits. The seemingly surface-level choices made ended up meaning a hell of a lot more in the long run. The fact that the main takeaway they give from Actor Age is that she's still overachieving and ready to tackle adulthood head-on is a powerful precedent to set on its own. For all the ups and downs we've experienced here, the one thing that wasn't left up to chance is the core value of each and every character. The special itself doesn't give you enough background on the older counterparts to run with, but they are undoubtedly still the kids in the backyard still making the most of their days. There's still plenty of questions that should be answered, but I'm glad the integrity of the characters isn't an element I have to spend time wondering what might have been of it. You know, it's crazy I chose to begin by talking about Survivor because their romances were never this intense. Like, I'm serious. I mean, a lot of them were just kind of flings. You know, you fling a bunch of random adults in some isolated area. They have no connection to the outside world. They're forced to build their own shelter and find their own food. And some of them succeed at it, but a fair amount of them don't. So they have needs, and they go and satisfy them. They go and fuck behind a bush for like 20 minutes, and that's just an arrangement that they keep up. The clips that I used came from season 19, Survivor Samoa, which in many people's eyes is considered like the peak of the franchise, because that was a time when Survivor was just a different beast altogether. Like, people almost died on screen several times. Now they just be leaving giant bags of rice for them so they don't lose too much muscle mass. But back then, shit was just different. And even in the midst of that, there were several power couples that stayed until after the game was over. There are some couples that are still survived to this very day, if you can believe it. I don't think Phinabella could really touch that, but it is in a league of its own, truly. It's crazy how much the January 13th announcement kind of changed shit. Again, in any other circumstance, we could have ended the video maybe like 20 minutes earlier, but the prospect of a reboot definitely brings some new dynamics into play. A lot of people are excited for more Phinabella moments, and I totally respect that. But there's also a fair amount of people that are just like, fuck it, you need to redo Actor Age, you need to do this shit all over again, and you need to prove that they're canon in the right way. And I'm like, yeah? We ended off the entire show as we knew it, with the understanding that Stacy is the only person within this whole spread of people that knows that Perry's a secret agent, and this is your top priority? Like I said, I think the ship is a huge part of this show. I don't think they need to redo anything. I mean, there's like a Phinabella moment every 3 or 4 episodes. There's more than enough content so that you can survive and thrive for X amount of time. And if the reboot is, in fact, in keeping with the older parts of the series, those moments are just going to show up naturally. And honestly, as cool as it was to see develop in real time, it was also incredibly exhausting. I don't know why you would want to go through that shit again. Couldn't be me. In appropriate proportion to that, writing the script for this was also similarly painful. I don't know why the fuck it took me 6 months to figure out how to say, hey, Isabella's a great character, but you also fumble the bag as far as development goes. But it did, and that was a struggle. I would like to thank Cadence for making this a little less painful for me. A lot of her takes inspired how I see Phinabella in the current moment, and she gave the script a beta read and gave me notes and everything. She's amazing. Go and follow her work. I think that would have been just easier than watching this beast. but just go and follow her work. I'm also going to shout out Mwaka, the musical without a cool acronym again. I have been meaning to hype them up for a while, and it just has not come to pass. But I will say that witnessing the confession scene did kind of push me into starting to actually do this. Because I think, if I look back in my records, I've been planning to maybe talk about this ship for a while. But once I saw that, I was like, oh, okay. Things could have been different, huh? So I would largely credit them for this existing. So thank you for that. There should be a small short list of stuff that I referenced or pointed out in this video, so go and check out all of those resources and creators and such. Whatever comes out next is not going to be something on this scale. I do have something cooking that is at least 3 times as long as this, though, so buckle in for that. But I know better. I'm not even going to give you a parameter. I'm just going to say, I will see you whenever. Yeah, that works.